Tere are some horror stories dat vruchten is bechouse ty take plate some were op vieuslei dangerous. An abandoned building. A dark forest. An empty road in the middle of nowhere. We understand the warning almost immediately because the setting itself tells us to be afraid. Bidgerol in the basement begins with the something vermoere in settling, a house that looks completely ordinary. A plate were a familie eats dinner, argies, sleeps, goes to work, and carries onwittige routines dat make a home feel safe. And uit beneath dat familiar surface is a space were a eng wo man kan disappear from the world while remaining basically close to the people who are supposed to know her best. Dat contradiction is wat makes the film so disturbing. Sarah is not talking to some distant person where nobody knows her name. Sy is trapped beneath her of home. The people upstairs are separated from her by a floor, a ceiling, a locked door, and a carefully constructedly. The distance is physical, but the deeper distance is psychological. Sarah kan hear the world continuing without her. Sy kan knof dat liefde is happening just a few steps away while being completely powerless to participate in it and that creates the central nightmare of the film, of kan sommige disappear without truly disappearing. The basement is therefore more than a setting. It is the peaceful expression of control. Upstairs represents ordinary life, family routines, veiligheid, movement, and the illusion that everything is exactly where it's helpen. Downstairs tussen asymptoons collapse. The same house contains two completely different realities. One is visible. The other is deliberately hidden. And the terrifying part is that the hidden reality does not require some supernatural force to exist. It requires only one person willing to control another person completely and a family environment where that control can remain controlled. At the center of that nightmare is Sarah, a teenager who begins the story wanting something that's held never half been considered dangerous, independence. Like countless teenagers, ze wants to make her own choices, it brings the world beyond her parents, and move closer toward adulthood. Her desire is ordinary. Her father's response is not. Don't see her growing independence not as a natural part of growing up, but as a challenge to his authority. Wat begins as possessiveness become something much darker because don't cannot accept the possibility that Sarah belongs to herself. That distinction matters. The horror of the story is not simply that Don becomes violent. It is that he begins treating control as a form of ownership. He wants to decide weer Sarah goes, wat ze does, hoe ze bekomes, and eventually whether she can exist independently at all. The film takes the familiar idea of an authoritarian parent and pushes it toward its most horrifying extreme. A parent is supposed to protect a child while preparing that child to live without them. Don reverses that purpose. He attempts to make Sarah permanently dependent on him. And this is where the film's psychological horror becomes more powerful than its physical setting. Captivity is not created by walls alone. It is created through fear, manipulation, isolation, threats, restricted information, and the gradual destruction of a person's belief that resistance is possible. A lokke door kan keep sommige inside, but psychological control kan maak te outside word veel impossible stand. Ofertime, survival my depend on understanding te relis of te persoon wo create te person. Sarah's greatest challenge ten is not simply escaping a room. It is preserving some part of herself inside a situation designated to erase her choices. That is why the story becomes less about a single act of violence and more about what prolonged captivity does to identity. The longer Sarah remains hidden, the more difficult it becomes to imagine the persoon se was before. The teenagerol wo onze wanted freedom has to become sommige capable of surviving without it. Meanwhile, above her ordinary life continues. That contrast is almost unbearable. People kan lage, talk, eat, sleep, and go about their routines while something terrible exists directly beneath them. The house becomes a machine for separating appearances from reality. Wat looks like familie stabiliteit from the outside is actually consualing complete devastation. And dan is vruchtening precisely because the film does not need him to look like a traditional monster. A monster will be a seer to understand. A monster will announce itself. Dan gaan exist inside the appearance of normaliteit. Hy kan occupiete role of vader, husband, and autoriteit figure wille secretly becoming Sarah's captor. Dat contradiction is central to the film's disturbing power because it challenges one of our strongest assumptions, that familiarity equals safety. We instinctively trust home. We associate it with the privacy, protection, childhood memories, and the people who knov is most intimately. Gerol in the basement talk is that emotional association and turns it inside out. The plate that zult represent freedom from danger becomes the plate where danger is most completely controlled. And onze dat idea settles in, the film's central question becomes much harder to ignore. It is not simply how did Sarah survive. It is also how did the vrouwen else fail to see her. What happens when a person's suffering is hidden behind an ordinary routine? What happens when authority is trusted so completely that nobody thinks to question it? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what happens when the person controlling the victim is someone the victim onze belief het wil protect her. Tuose questions are wat maak Sarah's story more than a conventional captivity thriller. The film wants is to feel the terror of confinement, but it also wants is to understand the emotional betrayal underneath it. Sarah is not simply imprisoned by a stranger. Sy is betrayed by sommige wose role in haar levenshoud have made such imprisonment impossible. Dat is weer the story truly begins. Before we examine the characters, the symbolism, the performances, or the filmmaking choices, we have to understand the specific kind of fear girl in the basement is trying to create. This is not fear of the inknoven in the traditional sense. It is fear of discovering that the familiar may have been hiding something from all along. And the more ordinary the house looks, the more disturbing the basement becomes. Part 1.2 Video Roadmap. To understand why gerol in the basement works as effectively as it does, it is not enough to simply retell what happens. The basic premise is already shocking. A teenage girl is imprisoned by her vader beneath the family home and remains hidden from the outside world for years. Dat alone geveste story en immediate emotional charge. Bitsok is onlei te beginning. The more interesting gestion is why the story continues to affect audiences after the initial revelation has already been spoiled. This analysis will move beyond the surface level recap and examine the machinery underneath the film. We will look at Sarah's transformation, Don's obsession with the control, the relationships inside the family, and the psychological mechanisms that allow captivity to continue. We will also look at the basement itself because its importance goes for beyond production desigen. It becomes a visual and psychological representation of everything the characters refuse to see. We also have two separate three different things that can easily become confused. Here is the story presented by the movie. Here is the psychological reality the movie is attempting to dramatize. And here is the real world case that inspired the premise. Those three layers overlap, but they are not identical. Gerol in the basement is a fictionalized television drama inspired by real events, not a documentary reconstruction. The distinction becomes especially important when we evaluate the film's strengths and limitations. The story itself follows Sarah from adolescence into a completely transformed existence. At the beginning, her conflict with the Don resembles the kind of family tension that can appear in many households. A teenager wants freedom. A parent wants authority. The difference is that Don cannot accept the natural condition of that conflict. He does not see Sarah's independence as evidence that she is growing up. He sees it as a threat that must be eliminated. That psychological shift becomes the foundation of everything that follows. We will also examine Don without reducing him to a simple cartoon villain. His actions are horrific, but understanding the mechanism behind them is more revealing than simply labeling him evil. His behavior is driven by entitlement, possessiveness, and an obsessive need for control. The film presents a man who believes authority geves him te rug to define another person's reality. Sarah becomes the opposite force. She represents autonomy, identity, and the stubborn human desire to retain some control over oneself even when almost every eternal choice has been taken away. Ten tiere is the family itself. The people upstairs become a part of the film's most painful dramatic irony. Their normal routines continue while Sarah's life is disappearing beneath them. Every ordinary family moment gaan tevore beïnterpreted differently ons te audience knows what is happening. A house that initially looks safe begins to feel like a solid system built around secrecy. That is one of the film's most effective storytelling techniques. It does not need every scene to become overtly vruchtene. Sometimes the ordinary scenes are more disturbing because we know what the characters do not know. A normal conversation can suddenly carry the weight of everything happening just out of sight. From there, the analysis will move into the film's filmmaking langjage. We will look at how limited spaces create claustrophobia, how lighting and framing reinforce captivity, how the editing handles the passage of time, and how Elizabeth Rem's direction balances an extraordinarily disturbing premise with the accessible emotional langjage of a television drama. We will also examine sound and missies, bechouse en a story built around separation, wat Sarah juist gaan bekome almost as important as wat ze sies. Footsteps above her, doors opening, voices drifting trouwge te house, and moments of silence al reinforce te same pynvol realiteit. The outside world is close enough to her bit impossible to reach. After that, we will widen the lens. The film exists within a larger culture of extreme storytelling, legitimate dramas, survival narratives, and fascination with the hidden shrimps. Its emotional impact cannot be separated completely from the audience's awareness that the premise has roots in real-world horror. That creates both the film's power and one of its biggest ethical complications. Because when real suffering becomes entertainment, the question is not only whether the story is compelling. We also have to ask what gets lost when an unimaginable human experience is compressed into a television narrative. That is where the film becomes more complicated. It can be emotionally effective and dramatically simplified at the same time. It can create empathy while also relying on familiar television conventions. It can make audiences think about hidden abuse while still transforming that abuse into a structured story with a beginning, middle, climax, and resolution. So the goal here is not to simply tell girl into basement a great movie or a bad one. Those labels are too easy for a story is complicated. Instead, we are going to examine what the film is trying to accomplish, where it succeeds, where its format limits it, and why its central image remains so difficult to forget. Because ons we understand what the basement actually represents, we begin to realize that the most frustrating part of the story was never the room itself. It was the realiteit dat everyone upstairs was allowed to believe. Part 1.3 Audience Foundation. There is a reason stories about hidden captivity affect audiences so deeply. Beneath the extreme circumstances is a fear that almost everyone understands instinctively. What if danger exists somewhere that is supposed to be safe? For many people, home is one of the first places associated with the security. Childhood is remembered trouwige bedrooms, kitchens, family conversations, doors opening in the morning, and familiar voices calling from another room. Even when family life is imperfect, the concept of home carries an emotional premise. It is supposed to be the place where ou kan lower our gehoord. Gerol in the basement destroys that assumption. Sarah's original desire is especially important because it is so ordinary. Sy wants independence. Sy wants to experience life beyond the restrictions of childhood. Sy wants to become an adult. There is nothing inherently rebellious about that desire. In fact, adolescence is built around it growing it means gradually moving away from parental control and developing an identity that belongs to her. Beton interprets that process differently. He sees Sarah's independence as reaction. Instead of understanding that she is becoming her own person, he treats her autonomy as something he has the right to prevent. That creates one of the film's most disturbing inversions. The parent-child relationship is supposed to move in one direction. Parents provide protection, children grow and eventually children become independent. Don't turns that process backward. He attempts to stop Sarah's development by force. Protection bekomes position. Autoriteit bekomes domination. Lofe bekomes a justification for control. And once that happens, the word family itself becomes complicated. The film also touches a particularly deep fear, the fear of not being believed. For some trapped inside an abusive environment, isolation is not only about peaceful distance. It is about losing access to people who make it confirm that our experience is real. If the person controlling how also controls the story verhoudene else heers, then the victim gaan bekome trapped inside sommige else's version of reality. That is why the Epstein's world matters so much. Sarah is not completely separated from her family. She is painfully closer to them. She kan hier liefde continue. Sy knofstad pople sy loofes are nearby. Uit sy gaan het simply chill out and maak het hem understand. The film weep onewiste ordinary assumptions people make about families. We tend to believe that parents knof their children. We assume that sommige living in the same house world notice major changes. We trust familiar routines. We often interpret private family matters as something that belongs inside the family, not something outside the held investigate. Those assumptions are exactly what make hidden abuse so difficult to imagine. There is also an important distinction between visible violence and invisible control. Physical violence is sy to recognize when we see it. Psychological control can be much harder to identify because it can exist through threats, isolation, manipulation, intimidation, and the gradual destruction of confidence. A persoon may appear physically present while having almost no meaningful freedom. That idea makes Sarah's journey particularly painful. Her survival depends on adapting to conditions that should never have existed. She must learn when to resist, when to remain silent, when to protect herself, and how to preserve her identity inside a system designed to take choices away from her. For modern audiences, this sonnet strongly with the fascination surrounding true crime stories about hidden captivity. Viewers are often drawn to the question of sommige veld remain hidden for eiers, but inderdaad that curiosity is something more uncomfortable. We want to understand the warning signs. We want to know of ordinary people can fail to recognize the extraordinary danger. We want to believe that if we weer tiere we wilt notice. En dat is weer een gerol in het basement keitlei terens de gestion bak toewaard is. Te more ordinary te setting uppers, te harder te story bekomes to dismiss as something that happens only in the stand or in familiar places. Te house looks normal. Te family looks normal. Te relationships initially look recognizable. That normality is not a distraction from the horror. It is the mechanism that makes the horror possible. The basement becomes vruchtening because of what it contradicts. It says that a house can contain a secret. A family can contain a lie. Autority can control abuse. And a persoon gaan bepaisitale closer to freedom while remaining psychologically unreachable. That is the fear we carry into the rest of the story. Because before Sarah becomes a symbol of survival, she is simply a teenager who wants to live home. And the tragedy begins when the person standing in the doorway decides she has no recht to live. Part 2, Content Background. 2.1 Production Origins. Girl Interbasement belongs to a television tradition built around stories that talk something vruchtening lei recognizable and bisse toward an extreme. Legitima has spent decades producing dramas centered on domestic danger, abusive relationships, crime, disappearance, survival, and real-life inspired situations. The apple of these stories is often rooted in a simple contradiction. The setting looks familiar, but the circumstances are anything but. Dat maak is gerol interbasement a particularly natural fit for the network storytelling model. The premise immediately contains the ingredients of a concept television thriller. There is a teenage protagonist, an authoritarian father, a family home, a hidden room, a disappearance, and a crime that remains concealed in plain sight. But the social material adds another layer of difficulty because the story is inspired by one of the most disturbing captivity cases of the modern era, the Fritzl case in Austria. That real-world connection changes the responsibility of the adaptation. The movie is not presenting itself as a documentary. It fictionalizes and dramatizes its material, reshaping real events into a narrative designate for television. Dat means characters, chronologie, dialogie, and dramatic circumstances gaan besimplified or altered in order to create a coherent story. For a conventional fictional thriller, twose choices mag it belargelei invisible. With a real-world inspiration is disturbing, however, the distance between entertainment and reality becomes impossible to ignore. De filmmakers daarvoor facet a difficult balancing uit. They had to create enige dramatic tension to hold an audience while dealing with a subject matter that could easily become unbearable if presented without restraint. The challenge was not simply making the story vruchtening. The real challenge was making the audience remain emotionally connected to Sarah rather than reducing her suffering to a collection of shocking events.
That is why the decision to center the story around Sarah is so important. The film does not primarily approach the case as an investigative procedural. We are not watching detectives methodically uncover clues for most of the story. Instead, the narrative spends much of its time inside the family environment, and increasingly, inside Sarah's experience of captivity. This changes the emotional structure. The question is not simply whether the crime will be discovered. We already understand the danger. The question becomes how Sarah can survive inside it. That shift allows the film to operate as a character-centered survival story, rather than a conventional mystery. The production design also becomes crucial. A story about captivity does not require enormous sets or elaborate visual effects. In fact, scale could work against the premise. The smaller and more restricted the environment feels, the more effectively the audience can understand Sarah's lack of freedom. The basement therefore functions as both a practical location and a storytelling tool. Its walls establish boundaries. Its doors create barriers. Its limited light creates uncertainty. Its separation from the rest of the house makes ordinary sounds feel distant and unreachable. Every architectural element can communicate control without needing dialogue to explain it. This is one reason television limitations can sometimes become advantages. A large production might be tempted to constantly expand the visual world. Here, restriction is the point. The fewer places Sarah can go, the more psychologically oppressive the story becomes. Lighting follows the same principle. The basement is not simply dark because darkness looks frightening. Limited visibility reinforces Sarah's limited access to information. She cannot see the world outside clearly. She cannot participate in it. Her environment narrows as her choices narrow. The casting is equally important because the entire story depends on believable family relationships. If Sarah and Dawn do not initially feel connected as father and daughter, the betrayal loses some of its emotional force. The audience needs to understand that this is not a stranger entering Sarah's life. This is someone who already has authority, familiarity, and emotional access. That familiarity is what makes the transformation so disturbing. Dawn cannot simply become frightening overnight. The more effective version of this character is one who demonstrates how control can hide inside ordinary authority. Strictness can be normalized. Possessiveness can be disguised as concern. Anger can be excused as discipline. The film's horror grows from watching those boundaries disappear. Director Elizabeth Rome's approach is therefore less about spectacle and more about emotional proximity. Her background as an actor is relevant here because the film relies heavily on performances to make the domestic relationships believable. The camera repeatedly brings us close to the characters during moments of confrontation, fear, and emotional breakdown. That intimacy has a specific purpose. The audience is not supposed to observe Sarah's captivity from a safe distance. We are meant to understand how her world becomes smaller. The house becomes a prison without needing to look like one. The basement becomes a reality that is simultaneously physically contained and emotionally enormous. And this returns us to the central contradiction of the film. The production does not need to create a fantasy world to frighten us. It only needs to make an ordinary domestic environment feel slightly different once we understand what is happening inside it. That is where the television format becomes both the film's strength and its limitation. It gives the story accessibility, emotional immediacy, and a familiar visual language. But it also creates pressure to simplify material that is psychologically and historically much more complicated than a 90-minute-plus drama can fully contain. The question, then, is whether the film can use those limitations without allowing them to erase the complexity of what inspired it. And that question becomes even more important when we place the movie within the television landscape that existed before it was released. 2.2. Pre-release landscape. By the time Girl in the Basement arrived, audiences were already familiar with the language of true crime-inspired television. Stories about missing women, abusive partners, dangerous families, kidnappings, secret identities, and domestic deception had become a recognizable part of the television landscape. Lifetime understood this audience. These films often begin with something familiar: a new relationship, a family gathering, a move into a new house, a teenager becoming independent, a seemingly ordinary marriage. Then the story reveals that the familiar environment contains a threat nobody initially recognized. The formula works because it transforms everyday life into a source of suspense. Supernatural horror tells us that something impossible has entered the world. Real-world inspired horror does something more psychologically uncomfortable. It tells us that the world we already know may contain things we do not understand. There is no monster from another dimension required. The threat can be a person, a relationship, or a private space hidden behind an ordinary door. Girl in the Basement takes that formula to an especially extreme level. The marketing premise is almost impossible to forget. A teenager, her father, a basement, and years of captivity. Even viewers who know the basic story before pressing play still have a reason to watch. The mystery is no longer simply what happened. It becomes how did this continue for so long? That distinction is important. Spoilers do not completely destroy suspense when the central event is already known. In fact, knowing the premise can sometimes make the experience more uncomfortable, because the audience watches ordinary moments while carrying information that the characters do not have. Every family scene becomes layered. Every time someone walks through the house, the audience remembers what is beneath them. Every ordinary conversation can feel like dramatic irony. The characters may believe they understand their family, while the audience knows that their understanding is incomplete. This is also where the cultural fascination with hidden crimes becomes relevant. People are naturally drawn to mysteries that challenge assumptions about what can remain unseen. How can a person disappear? How can neighbors fail to notice? How can relatives miss warning signs? How can an ordinary home conceal an extraordinary crime? Those questions are disturbing because they are not limited to one case. They force audiences to think about the systems that allow people to disappear socially even when they remain physically present. They raise questions about privacy, authority, family reputation, and the tendency to assume that what happens inside a home is nobody else's business. The premise therefore carried unusual psychological weight even before the film began. But that also created a problem. The audience already knew the story was going to be disturbing. The film could not rely on surprise alone. It had to create emotional investment. This is where the performances and family dynamics become essential. If the audience only waits for the next terrible event, the story risks becoming a sequence of increasingly shocking moments. If the audience becomes invested in Sarah as a person, however, the same events become part of a larger emotional journey. The difference is enormous. One approach asks what terrible thing happens next. The other asks what will this do to her? The second question is much more important for the film because captivity is not defined by one event. It is defined by duration. Time changes everything. A person does not experience years of confinement the same way they experience the first day. Fear can become routine. Resistance can become calculation. Hope can become fragile. Survival can become its own form of work. The film therefore enters a television landscape already trained to respond to sensational premises, but its most interesting material lies beneath that sensational surface. The challenge is to turn an outrageous headline into a human story. That is why the domestic setting matters so much. If Sarah were imprisoned somewhere obviously isolated, the audience could categorize the story as an extraordinary crime. By placing the horror underneath a family home, the movie creates a much more unsettling contrast between appearance and reality. The house becomes a character in its own right. It contains memories, routines, arguments, family milestones, and ordinary domestic life. But it also contains the evidence of a hidden existence that almost nobody knows about. That contradiction is the engine of the story. And once the film establishes it, the narrative can finally move from the question of what the premise is to the question of how Sarah's life changes because of it. Because the most horrifying part of captivity is not the moment the door closes. It is what happens after the door has been closed for so long that the prisoner begins to understand how much of the world has continued without them. Part 3 Story Recap 3.1 Act 1 Setup. At the beginning of Girl in the Basement, Sarah is not defined by captivity. She is defined by possibility. She is a teenager standing at the uncomfortable boundary between childhood and adulthood, looking toward a future that she believes should eventually belong to her. That future creates tension with Dawn. From the outside, the family can appear ordinary. There are parents, children, routines, disagreements, and the everyday friction that comes with living together. But beneath that ordinary surface is a growing imbalance in the relationship between Sarah and her father. Don's authority is not simply parental guidance. He expects obedience, and he reacts strongly when Sarah begins expressing a desire for independence. This is where the story establishes one of its most important contrasts. Sarah sees growing up as freedom. Don sees growing up as losing control. Those two interpretations cannot coexist peacefully. Sarah wants the ability to make choices about her own life. She wants to experience the world beyond her father's restrictions. She wants the ordinary freedoms associated with becoming an adult. But Don interprets those desires personally. Instead of recognizing adolescence as a natural process, he treats Sarah's independence as an act of disobedience. That changes the emotional atmosphere inside the house. What might have been a normal parent-child conflict becomes something more dangerous because Don's identity is tied to authority. He is not simply angry that Sarah disagrees with him. He is threatened by the idea that she may eventually no longer need his permission. Sarah's relationship with the rest of the family adds another layer to this conflict. Her mother and siblings exist within the same household, but they do not necessarily experience Don in exactly the same way Sarah does. This difference creates dramatic irony. The audience begins to see a gap between Don's public family identity and the private intensity of his relationship with Sarah. That gap becomes increasingly important. Don can appear like a father enforcing rules. Sarah experiences those rules as suffocating. From the outside, the difference may seem like ordinary family tension. From Sarah's perspective, it is the gradual disappearance of choice. Eventually, Sarah reaches a point where leaving becomes more than a teenage fantasy. She wants to move toward independence, and that desire becomes the catalyst for Don's most horrifying decision. The moment that should represent Sarah moving into adulthood instead becomes the moment her father decides she will never be allowed to leave. The story's genre changes almost instantly. What began as a family drama becomes a captivity thriller. Sarah is taken from the world she understands and placed inside the basement. The physical environment establishes a new set of rules. The house that once represented home now contains a prison. The father who once represented authority now controls every aspect of Sarah's existence. And the transformation is horrifying precisely because the physical location has not changed. It is still the family home. But for Sarah, home has ceased to mean safety. The basement becomes the boundary between the life she expected and the life she has been forced to live. There is no normal transition between those two realities. One moment Sarah is a teenager imagining freedom. The next, she is confronted with a future in which freedom has been deliberately removed. The first reveal of the basement therefore functions as more than a plot twist. It establishes the film's central metaphor. The world upstairs continues. Sarah does not. Not in the way she once imagined. The rules of her existence are now determined by someone else. Movement, communication, food, information, and contact with the outside world can all be controlled. Even time itself begins to feel different because the ordinary markers of teenage life disappear. The story has crossed its threshold. Sarah is no longer simply fighting with her father. She is fighting to remain herself. 3.2. Act 1 Continued Call to Adventure. The first emotional response to captivity is disbelief. Sarah cannot immediately understand the reality she has entered because the person responsible is her own father. The mind naturally resists contradictions this extreme. A parent is supposed to be a source of protection. Dawn has transformed that role into the mechanism of imprisonment. That betrayal makes the basement more frightening than its walls. Sarah is not only trapped by physical barriers. She is trapped inside a relationship that has been completely inverted. First, she tests the limits. She looks for opportunities to escape. She tries to understand Dawn's behavior. She searches for weaknesses in the system. These attempts matter because they establish that Sarah does not immediately become passive. Her instinct is to resist. But Dawn understands that physical resistance is not the only thing he needs to defeat. He can use fear. He can control information. He can control access to food and communication. He can decide when Sarah sees him and when she does not. Most importantly, he can make her understand that every attempt to challenge him could have consequences. This is how captivity begins becoming psychological rather than merely physical. The basement has walls, but Dawn's greatest weapon is uncertainty. Sarah does not know what he might do. She does not know how long she will be there. She does not know whether anyone upstairs suspects anything. She does not know whether rescue is coming. That uncertainty can become its own prison. And then there is the sound of the family continuing above her. This is perhaps one of the cruelest details of the story. Sarah is not taken to a remote location where the outside world disappears completely. She remains close enough to hear it. Family members move through the house. Ordinary routines continue. Life happens just beyond the barrier. For Sarah, those sounds become reminders of everything she has lost. A voice upstairs is not simply a voice. It is evidence that the world still exists. A door closing is not simply a household sound. It is a reminder of the barrier between her and freedom. Footsteps can mean someone is near, but they can also mean someone is leaving. The house becomes an acoustic map of a world Sarah can hear but cannot reach. Her emotional response therefore becomes increasingly complicated. Anger remains, but so does fear. Hope remains, but it becomes harder to sustain. The person she once knew as her father is now the person controlling her reality. Sarah eventually begins learning a devastating lesson. Direct confrontation may not always be the safest form of resistance. That does not mean she has surrendered. It means she is adapting. And adaptation is one of the most difficult ideas in the entire film because from the outside it can resemble acceptance. A survivor may learn routines, calculate risks, and adjust behavior simply because survival requires it. But adapting to captivity is not the same as accepting captivity. Sarah's objective changes. First, she wants to escape immediately. Then she begins to understand that surviving today may be necessary before escaping tomorrow becomes possible. That psychological shift marks the true beginning of her transformation. She has crossed from the world of ordinary adolescence into a world where every decision has consequences. The teenager who once wanted freedom now has to learn how to survive without it. And while Sarah is forced to adapt below the house, the family upstairs continues living as though nothing has fundamentally changed. That contrast makes the captivity even more devastating. The world has not stopped. It has simply stopped for Sarah. 3.3. Act 2: A Rising Action. As time passes, the story's horror changes shape. The initial shock of captivity gives way to something slower and more psychologically devastating: routine. Routine is one of the most important elements of long-term captivity. Because repetition can transform even extraordinary circumstances into a grim version of normality. Sarah's world becomes defined by patterns, restrictions, threats, and whatever small opportunities for control remain available to her. The passage of time changes her. She is no longer simply the teenager who entered the basement. Her body changes. Her emotional world changes. Her understanding of Dawn changes. Her understanding of herself changes. And eventually motherhood becomes part of that existence. The children born during Sarah's captivity introduce an entirely new emotional dimension, because they are both victims of the environment and sources of meaning within it. Sarah is no longer surviving only for herself. Her responsibilities become larger, and so does the emotional cost of failure. Motherhood under coercion is one of the film's most complicated ideas, because it contains both vulnerability and strength. Sarah's children connect her to the life that has been forced upon her, but they also give her reasons to continue protecting something beyond herself. Dawn's manipulation extends into that relationship as well. Control does not stop with Sarah. He attempts to shape the children's understanding of the world around them, constructing a reality in which the basement becomes normal and the outside world becomes distant or frightening. That is how captivity can reproduce itself psychologically. A prison does not have to rely entirely on chains if the prisoner begins to believe the boundaries are permanent. Sarah, however, continues to preserve pieces of herself. Memory becomes important. Remembering who she was before captivity is a quiet form of resistance. Her former life may no longer be physically accessible, but it remains part of her internal identity. The teenager who wanted freedom has not completely disappeared. She has been buried beneath years of survival. This creates the central psychological contradiction of the middle act. To survive, Sarah must adapt. But adaptation can feel dangerously close to surrender. Every routine she learns makes the basement easier to navigate, but it also demonstrates how much of her life has been absorbed into the system Dawn created. Survival requires her to understand the rules of captivity, without allowing those rules to define who she is. That is a much harder battle than simply finding an unlocked door. Dawn's power also depends on maintaining the family's false narrative. Upstairs, the absence of Sarah has to be explained somehow. Her disappearance must fit into a story that people can accept. This is where the ordinary appearance of the family home becomes crucial again. The deception does not need to be spectacular. It only needs to be believable enough. And that is one of the film's most disturbing observations. Enormous crimes can depend on surprisingly ordinary lies when nobody expects to find a reason to question them. As the years pass, the possibility of escape becomes increasingly complicated. Sarah's former life moves further away. The outside world changes while she remains trapped in the same physical environment. People upstairs grow older. Relationships change. Time accumulates. The basement does not simply imprison Sarah's body. It creates a distorted relationship with time itself. A day can feel endless when there is nothing to do. Years can disappear when every day resembles the one before it. That is why small acts of resistance become so meaningful. A memory preserved. A choice made. A moment of emotional connection. Anything that proves Sarah is still more than the role Dawn has forced upon her becomes important. Her survival is therefore not loud. It is often quiet. And that quietness is part of what makes it powerful. Sarah does not defeat Dawn through physical strength. She survives by refusing to let his definition of her become the only definition that exists. But as the years continue, that struggle becomes harder. The question is no longer whether Sarah can survive another day. It becomes whether she can imagine a future at all. 3.4. Act 2B Midpoint Crisis. Eventually, the passage of years becomes impossible to ignore. The most terrifying realization is not simply that Sarah has been trapped for a long time. It is that the life she once expected has continued without her. The teenager who entered the basement has grown older inside it. The world she imagined when she wanted independence has become almost unrecognizable. This is where captivity becomes permanent in a psychological sense. At the beginning, Sarah believes the situation must eventually end. Someone will discover her. Dawn will make a mistake. An opportunity will appear. Rescue remains imaginable because the alternative is too overwhelming to accept. But time attacks that hope. The longer the captivity continues, the more difficult it becomes to believe that the outside world is still waiting for her. And this is where the children become even more important. They have no memory of the world Sarah remembers. For them, the basement is not a temporary prison they entered after having known freedom. It is the environment in which their understanding of reality develops. Sarah therefore faces two different battles. She must preserve her own identity, while also helping her children understand a world that has been deliberately distorted. Dawn's control depends on making the basement feel inevitable. Sarah's resistance depends on keeping alive the idea that another reality exists. That is why hope becomes more complicated. Hope cannot simply mean waiting for someone else to save her. If rescue never comes, waiting can become another form of psychological paralysis. Sarah has to develop a more sophisticated form of survival. She must find meaning inside circumstances she cannot immediately change. The basement gradually becomes its own psychological universe. Upstairs and downstairs are no longer simply two floors of a house. They represent two versions of reality. Upstairs, time moves normally. Downstairs, time is measured through captivity. Upstairs, family life continues. Downstairs, family has been transformed into something unrecognizable. Upstairs, doors are ordinary objects. Downstairs, a door can represent the entire concept of freedom. This is where the film's central metaphor becomes unavoidable. The basement is hidden, but the deeper prison is the story Dawn has constructed around it. He controls information. He controls movement. He controls what other people believe. He controls the explanation for Sarah's absence. He attempts to control the children's understanding of reality. The more successful that deception becomes, the more difficult discovery appears. Yet control has a weakness. It requires maintenance. A secret this large depends on every part of the story continuing to function. One mistake can create a crack. One unexplained detail can raise a question. One person can decide to look more closely. That possibility becomes the faint light at the edge of Sarah's story. The audience knows that the deception cannot last forever. But the emotional tension comes from not knowing exactly when or how it will collapse. The story is therefore moving from captivity toward exposure. Sarah has spent years fighting to survive inside the hidden world. Soon, that hidden world will collide with the reality outside it. And when that happens, Dawn's greatest weapon, his ability to control the story, will begin to disappear. 3.5. Act 3 Climax Resolution. The final act changes the emotional direction of the story, because the question is no longer simply how Sarah can survive captivity. The question becomes how the truth can finally escape the basement. Dawn's carefully constructed reality begins to collapse. The discovery of Sarah and the children transforms the story immediately. What was hidden becomes visible. What seemed impossible becomes undeniable. The family, the outside world, and the audience are forced to confront the reality that existed beneath an ordinary home. The emotional impact comes partly from the contrast. For years, the basement represented a secret reality known only to Dawn, Sarah, and eventually the children. Suddenly, that reality belongs to everyone. The truth cannot be controlled anymore. Dawn's authority depends on secrecy, and once secrecy disappears, so does much of his power. That does not mean Sarah's suffering disappears with the discovery. Rescue is not the same thing as recovery. This distinction is essential because conventional thrillers often treat escape as the emotional finish line. The door opens, the villain is defeated, the victim is safe, and the story ends. But psychological captivity does not work that way. A person can leave a room and still carry the room inside them. Sarah has to confront a world that continued while she was hidden. She has to exist outside the rules that controlled her for years. She has to understand what freedom means after having so little of it. The family also has to confront its own history. The people who lived upstairs must process the fact that something unimaginable happened directly beneath their daily lives. Their shock is not only about the crime itself. It is about the collapse of their understanding of their own home and their own family. The house can never mean exactly what it meant before. The basement can never be just a basement again. And Sarah's identity has to move beyond the label of victim. She is now a survivor. But even that word contains complexity. Survival does not mean that everything is suddenly okay. It means that Sarah endured something designed to destroy her sense of self, and emerged with that self still present. That is the emotional victory the film ultimately offers. Dawn could control space. He could control movement. He could control information. He could control Sarah's physical circumstances. But he could never completely control the person Sarah remained inside. That is why the ending is less triumphant than a conventional revenge thriller. Sarah does not simply walk away from the past as though nothing happened. Freedom is presented as the beginning of another journey, rather than the final reward. The basement has been opened, but the psychological doors do not disappear instantly. Recovery requires time. Identity requires rebuilding. Trust requires reconsideration. And perhaps that is the most honest emotional note available to a story like this. The ending does not erase the horror. Changes who controls the story. For years, Dawn controlled what people believed. Now Sarah's experience can finally be known. The secret is no longer his. And that transition, from hidden victim to visible survivor, leads naturally into the most important question of the film's character analysis. Who was Sarah before the basement? Who did she become inside it? And what part of her survived long enough to emerge on the other side? Part 4. Character Analysis 4.1. Protagonist Deep Dive. Sarah is most interesting when she is viewed as more than a victim. Calling her a victim is factually correct, but it does not fully describe her dramatic function. The film's deeper character arc is about agency. Sarah begins with the ordinary desire to control her own future, loses almost every external form of control, and then has to discover what agency can mean when choice itself has been severely restricted. At the beginning, freedom is simple. For a teenager, freedom can mean leaving the house, making decisions, meeting people, imagining adulthood, or simply being trusted. Sarah's desire for independence is therefore not a character flaw. It is evidence that she is growing. Dawn transforms that healthy development into a perceived threat. The tragedy is that Sarah's psychological wound is created by someone who should have helped her become independent. A parent is supposed to prepare a child for a world beyond the family. Dawn instead attempts to make the family permanent by force. That betrayal changes Sarah's understanding of trust. The person who should represent safety becomes the person from whom she needs protection. That contradiction can create a deeper psychological injury than physical confinement alone. Sarah does not simply lose her freedom. She loses the assumptions that once made the world understandable. Survival, therefore, becomes her new form of agency. She cannot choose where she lives. She cannot choose when she leaves. She cannot control what Dawn does. But she can sometimes choose how she responds. Those small choices become increasingly important. This is why adaptation should not automatically be interpreted as surrender. Sarah learns the routines of captivity because she has to. She learns what provokes Dawn, what risks are worth taking, and when patience may be more useful than confrontation. That is survival intelligence. It may look quiet from the outside, but it requires enormous psychological effort. Motherhood intensifies that effort. Sarah's children become both a source of vulnerability and a reason to continue. She has to protect them while living under the authority of the person who created the environment in which they exist. Her responsibilities become another reason to preserve her identity. She cannot simply think about escaping for herself. She has to think about what her children understand, what they fear, and what they might believe about the world. That turns motherhood into a form of resistance. Dawn wants the basement to define reality. Sarah tries to make sure it does not define everything her children know. Memory also becomes a form of survival. Remembering the girl she was before captivity allows Sarah to maintain a connection to an identity Dawn cannot completely erase. The teenager who wanted freedom may no longer have the same circumstances, but she remains part of Sarah. That is the key to her transformation. She does not survive by remaining unchanged. She survives by changing without completely losing herself. The distinction is subtle but important. A conventional action hero proves strength by defeating an opponent. Sarah proves strength by continuing to exist psychologically in an environment designed to convince her that she has no power. Her resistance is often invisible. Her strength is often quiet. And that makes her eventual rescue emotionally significant for a reason beyond escape. The outside world is not simply rescuing a captive. It is finally making space for a person whose identity has been suppressed for years. Sarah's story is therefore not about becoming strong because she was weak. It is about discovering that strength can exist even when almost every conventional source of power has been removed. That makes her one of the film's most compelling elements. 4.2. Antagonist psychology. Dawn is frightening not because he represents some supernatural form of evil, but because his behavior grows out of recognizable human concepts taken to an extreme. Authority, possessiveness, entitlement, control. A parent has authority over a child, but healthy authority has an endpoint. Its purpose is protection and preparation. Dawn removes that endpoint. He treats parental authority as permanent ownership. Sarah's independence becomes unacceptable because it threatens his identity as the person in control. That is the psychological engine of his behavior. The difference between protection and possession becomes one of the film's most important contrasts. Protection says, I want you to be safe enough to live your own life. Possession says, I want you to remain within my control. Dawn chooses possession. Once that distinction is established, the escalation becomes easier to understand. Strict parenting can become intimidation. Intimidation can become coercion. Coercion can become imprisonment. The steps may be dramatically compressed in the film, but the underlying logic remains consistent. Don does not simply want Sarah to obey him. He wants to eliminate her ability to choose against him. Control is therefore his primary psychological need. Physical violence may be part of the system, but fear and manipulation are often more important because they make control sustainable. A captive who believes resistance is dangerous can be controlled without constant physical force. Don's power also depends on constructing an alternative reality for everyone around him. The family upstairs must accept explanations for Sarah's absence. The children must understand their environment through the information he provides. The outside world must see the version of Don that he chooses to display. That creates the disturbing contrast between public father and private captor. The same man can participate in ordinary family life, while maintaining a hidden system of abuse beneath it. That normality is what makes him more frightening. A cartoon villain would separate evil from ordinary life. Don demonstrates how evil can exist inside ordinary roles when those roles are used to protect authority rather than responsibility. His behavior also connects to ideas about masculinity and control. He defines being a father through dominance. His authority is not secure unless other people submit to it. Sarah's independence therefore becomes threatening not simply because she is his daughter, but because her independence proves that his control has limits. Sarah and Don become thematic opposites. Sarah seeks autonomy. Don seeks absolute control. Sarah's identity grows through choice. Don's identity depends on removing choice from others. Sarah adapts because she wants to survive. Don refuses to adapt because he believes he should always remain in charge. That difference eventually becomes his weakness. Absolute control is impossible because it depends on controlling every variable. People change.
Circumstances change. Secretse fase. Other people kan make decisions. And onze Sarah's hidden existence is te stooferet, don looseste onethink dat made is seist impossible, his ability to define reality for everyone else. His ultimate failure is daarvoor not simply dat hy is kaget. Het is dat hy de stoofers control was never as complete as hy belief het. Hy geld lok uit door. Hy geld hide a persoon. Hy veld manipulate information. Bitte geld not permanently poses anoter iemand beings identiteit. Dat is why Sarah survival represents te thematic defiat of don long before te story reaches its literal conclusion. 4.3 Supporting cast dynamics. The supporting characters are important because they create the emotional architecture surrounding Sarah's captivity. They represent the normal family life that continues above her. Sarah's mother, siblings, and children all exist within different relationships to the truth. Some are innovare. Some are manipulated. Some are toehang to understand the environment they inhabit. Their incomplete knowledge becomes part of the tragedy. The mother's role is particularly complicated because the film is emotional power depends partly on the gap between what family members believe and what the audience knows. Sarah is basically closer to them, uit emotionele separated by Dawn's deception. Her siblings represent another painful contrast. They continue growing up into ordinary items of family life while Sarah's development has been violently interrupted. Their normality is not their fault, but it becomes heartbreaking because the audience understands what they cannot. Dat creates dramatic ironie. Our familie kan betogen daaraan stil op 'n profoundly dishonest. The children born during captivity introduce an even more complicated dynamic. Their understanding of the world is shaped by the environment in which they grow up. They do not possess the same memory Sarah has. For them, the basement kan bekome te beginning of reality rather than the interruption of it. Sarah therefore carries an enormous emotional burden. She is not simply trying to survive for herself. She is trying to protect her children from becoming psychologically trapped into the Dawn's version of the world. Die relations bekomes ohne of dit clearest reminders dat captiviteit van afwet generations within a single household. Dawn's manipulation is therefore not only bicycle. Het controls narratives. Het decides wat information is available. Het creates explanations. He establishes boundaries around what other people are allowed to understand. The supporting characters become victims of that deception in different ways because they cannot respond to information they do not possess. This is why the family's ignorance is so devastating. It is easy for an audience to ask why nobody noticed it. But the film's dramatic structure remains is that noticing and understanding are not the same thing. A person can see a family member's absence, hear a strange sound, or accept an explanation that seems plausible without understanding the larger reality. The supporting cast therefore embodies the film's broader concern with appearances. They solve of ordinary people can become a part of a hidden system without consciously participating in it. There is also very little room for conventional comic relief in a story this dark. The absence of lightness is significant because the film does not want the audience to escape the emotional weight of the premise trauge in related humor. The ensemble remains functional rather than sprawling. Every secondary character helps establish either Sarah's lost normality, Dawn's manipulation, or the consequences of the secret eventually being exposed. And that is why there incomplete knowledge matters. The family upstairs is not simply background. It is the world Sarah can herbet cannot reach. It represents everything she has been separated from. When that world finally distovers te trete, the emotional impact comes from the collision between two realities that have existed under the same roof for years. The family tauget they understood their Rome. Sarah kneeft they did not. That difference is the tragedy at the center of the supporting cast. Part 5, Thema Symbolism. 5.1 Core themes. At its heart, Girl in the Basement is a story about control versus autonomy. Everything else grows outward from that conflict. Sarah wants to make choices about her own life. Dawn wants to make those choices for her. The bicycle captivity is simply the most extreme expression of a conflict that begins much earlier. That is why the story resonates beyond its specific circumstances. De strigle voor autonomie is universal. E verhoudende eventuele reacties appoint weer het childhood autoriteit has toegeverwij to personal identiteit. Heeltyd families recognide dat transition. Don refuses it. Te film tervore terns aan normal developmental proces into a horror story. Childhood becomes adulthood, but instead of freedom expanding, freedom disappears. Dat leads directly into another central theme, protection versus possession. Parents are expected to protect children while teaching them how to survive independently. Don't treat protection as justification for ownership. His behavior demonstrates what happens when authority loses its purpose and becomes an end in itself. The result is not safety. It is imprisonment. Trust and betrayal form another major contrast. Sarah's relationship with Don begins within the structure of family trust. She knows him. She has grown up around him. Dat familiarity makes his betrayal more psychologically devastating than the actions of a stranger. The film therefore asks us to consider how much trust depends on roles. We trust parents because they are parents. We trust homes because they are homes. We trust families because they are families. But roles do not automatically guarantee safety. Dat idea vonnets directly to silence and truth. Captiviteit survives trouge silence. Don't system depends on keeping Sarah hidden and controlling the information available to a verhoudene else. The longer the truth remains concealed, the stronger the illusion becomes. Isolation is therefore not only passive. Sarah is isolated from communication, from normal time, from ordinary relationships, and from the ability to have her experience confirmed by others. Connection becomes a form of freedom. This is why motherhood matters thematically. Sarah's children create a relationship that Don cannot completely reduce to obedience. They give her another reason to maintain emotional connection even when the environment around her is designed to destroy it. The film also explores the difference between surviving and living. Survival is immediate. Living requires choice, identity, relationships, and a sense of future. Sarah initially has to focus on surviving. But the deeper struggle is preserving in oge of herself that leven kan eventually become possible again. That distinction is important because passive freedom does not automatically restore psychological freedom. A persoon kan lewe captiviteit en stil kry its release internally. The basement may disappear physically, but its psychological effects can remain. That is why the story's broader warning is not simply about violent criminals. It is about unchecked authority. Abuse gaan begin with the control before it becomes visibly violent. A demand for obedience gaan become isolation. Isolation gaan become dependency. Dependency gaan become as system where the victim's choices are progressively removed. The film passes that progression to an extreme, but the underlying warning is recognizable. Control becomes dangerous when another person's autonomy is treated as a problem that must be solved. And that is ultimately what Don tries to solve. Sarah's freedom. Her identity. Her ability to choose. The film's answer is clear. Toe se things gaan not belegitimately of net by Simeone Else. 5.2 Visual symbolism. The basement is the film's dominant visual symbol because it represents both the physical confinement and psychological control. It is not simply where Sarah escaped. It is what her life has been reduced to. Upstairs and downstairs function almost like two different worlds. Upstairs is associated with the ordinary family life, movement, licht, conversation, and the continuation of time. Downstairs is associated with the restriction, secrecy, repetition, and isolation. The stairs become the boundary between two realities. The sonnet the two worlds spatiale vele separating tem psychologically. Sarah kan beonlei a soort distance away from a verhoudene upstairs and het impossible far from them. Doors bekome egalei important. A door normale represents privacy or transition. In the basement, a door bekomes a barrier between Sarah and freedom. A locket in transe contains more meaning than its spaceful suggests because it represents Don's ability to decide whether Sarah can move between worlds. Windows create another painful contrast. A window can provide light, air and a visual connection to the outside. Bid for Simeone wo cannot leave, seeing freedom gaan so met die mismake confinement more painful. Darkness reinforces that separation. The limited elimination of the basement reduces Sarah's visual world just as Don reduces her access to information. The less ze kan see, the more dependent ze bekomes on wat ze hears and remembers. The film's framing often reinforces these ideas by plotting characters within architectural boundaries. Doorwys, wals, narrow spaces, and inclusive compositions remind the audience that Sarah's environment is constantly restricting her. The camera does not need to solve shines. The architecture is enough. Even ordinary domestic objects gaan bekome sinister wanneer meaning changes. Furniture, doors, stairs, household sounds, and familiar rooms all bekome reminders of what the house is hiding. That transformation is one of the film's strongest visual ideas. Nothing about the house needs to look supernatural. The horror comes from knowing what happened here. The samenstel dat mag het have onze been meaningless no represent separation. The samenstelling that belongs to an ordinary home becomes the barrier between Sarah and the people living above her. The same house becomes both a shelter and prison. Sarah's relationship with the bicycle environment also changes over time. At first, the basement represents immediate terror. Later, it becomes familiar in the most disturbing sense. She learns its routines and limitations because survival requires knowledge. The environment daarvoor becomes a psychological metaphor. A prison is not vruchtening only because it is inclusive. It is vruchtening because the inclusere begins to define the boundaries of possibility. The basement tells Sarah what she cannot do. Her resistance is the effort to remember what she still can be. 5.3 Dieper meanings. Onze te plot is stripped away girl in the basement becomes a story about the danger of trusting appearances. The family home appears normal. The father appears to occupy a familiar role. The household has routines. The outside world sees in nou normaliteit to accept the story het is gefeen. Dat is wat maak is the hidden shrimme possible. The film taps into the mythology of the perfect family, the idea that a family living together, apparing stable, and performing normal routines must therefore besave. But appearance is not evidence. Authority is another part of this idea. So ziet hij often transparance as significant amount of automatic trust. We assume they knowt their children. We assume they have their children's best interests in mind. We often hesitate to question what happens inside a private household because family privacy is treated as something that outsiders should respect. Dat respect gaan bekome dangerous when privacy is used as a shield for abuse. De basement tervore bekome is a metaphor for secrets. What happens downstairs represents everything the family cannot see, the community cannot imagine, and don't do not want anyone to know. The deeper message is that abuse survives when silence bekome stronger than suspicion. But the film also makes an important distinction between seeing and understanding. Sommige kan look at a situation and see nothing initial. Sommige kan hear a sound and dismiss it. Sommige gaan accept an explanation because it fits what they already believe. Understanding requires more than observation.